evening to you all, and welcome to the beautiful St. Nicholas Collegiate Church for an evening celebrating Nora Barnacle and James Joyce, the Galway story. It's going to be an evening of readings, conversation and music, highlighting Nora Barnacle, her life in Galway and her role in the Joyce Odyssey. I have to say, it's wonderful to be in front of a live audience again. So thank you for coming out. I'm really delighted to welcome our special guests and contributors for this performance tonight. Nuala O'Connor, author of Nora, a love story of Nora Barnacle and James Joyce. Ray Burke, author of Joyce County. His book about Joyce, Links to Galway, which was reissued earlier this year by Artisan Publishing House. Emily Cullen, poet and harper, who will be facilitating the conversational discussion between Nuala and Ray later on. Jim Higgins, Galway City Heritage Officer and a true Galwegian, who will introduce us to the literary heritage of Galway. Elizabeth Kane, my colleague, who will recite Joyce's She Weeps Over Rahoon and Sing the Sally Gardens. And our musicians, Carmel Dempsey, Emily Graney and Thomas Mannion. Nuala's book, Nora, has been chosen by Dublin City Libraries for their One Dublin One Book initiative for 2022. And in collaboration with them, Galway Public Libraries organised this event to celebrate Nora Barnacle here in Galway, her home place, and to highlight the wonderful month-long programme that has been organised by Dublin City Libraries for One Dublin One Book. Details of their programme can be found on the Dublin City Libraries website, or you can email cityofliterature@dublincity.ie. I would really like to extend a real Galway welcome to our library colleague from Dublin City Libraries, who is with us this evening, Jackie Lynham. So Nora, the book, is very much about Nora's side of the Joyce Odyssey. The Joyce County, about Joyce and Galway. And later, the collaboration and conversation between Nuala and Ray, facilitated by the poet Emily Cullen, will, I hope, broaden all our relationships with the Joyce family and their Galway connections. Throughout the evening, the Nora-themed music by Carmel Dempsey, Thomas Mannion and Emily Graney, and a special premiere of the poem Nora Barnacle Speaks by Nuala O'Connor from the 1921 project will enhance, I hope, the evening celebration of this West-East couple who eloped and had such a fascinating life in Europe. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome Jim Higgins, Galway City Heritage Officer, to set the scene on a literary Galway. Thank you.
Well, isn't this a wonderful place to be on a night like this? It's great to see people gathering together. It's absolutely fantastic. And St. Nicholas's is really the heart of medieval Galway. And they've recently completed a wonderful conservation plan which will allow the place to be used more and more by all and sundry in a very delightful manner. It's a fantastic place, and I always say when I'm given a tour of the place that it's where the best of divinity and humanity mix. It's a fantastic church. We've had a couple of events here over the years, and we hope to hold a couple of our heritage conferences, our annual heritage conferences here in the near future as well. A couple of years ago, we had the privilege of having Fritz Zen from the Zurich James Joyce Centre. He was brought over at the expense of the embassy, the Swiss embassy, and he gave us a wonderful talk here at a conference which at the time we thought we were reaching out, we were sort of stretching it a bit, but we called it 1,500 Years of Galway's Literary Heritage. And of course, you know, we're now heading on further with this event here. The library has, over the years, has done a whole series of wonderful events. The Galway, the Great Read, for instance, has really emphasised the importance of Galway literary figures and the great heritage that we have here in both English and Irish. St. Nicholas's was the site of one of the most famous of the Irish genealogists, wrote his book on the great book of Irish genealogy, Dultach Mac Ferbishig, and he wrote it out in College House, which is in the grounds here of St. Nicholas's Collegiate Church. So you have a very long literary heritage here. You also had a man called Elijah Cole, and he was a clergyman here. He was a lexicographer, and he was interested in the origins and the spread of words, and he wrote a very large dictionary of the English language. The title of it is a work of art in itself. An English dictionary explaining the difficult forms that are used in divinity, husbandry, physics, etc., and containing 1,000 hard words, together with their etymology, derivation, and so on, by Elijah Cole. Now, Elijah Cole is buried somewhere here in St. Nicholas's. We know that his gravestone was here, and there is a record of his gravestone. James Hardiman records it, but unfortunately the monument itself is lost. But his ghost is probably here somewhere, and he's looking down and saying, well, I hope these guys now know what they're talking about. So from Elijah Cole and Dultach Mac Ferbishig, we have all sorts of people associated with the literature of Galway, none more so than Nora Barnacle and James Joyce. And there's a considerable amount of folklore gathered around those two people. They only spent a couple of weeks in Nora Barnacle's house in Bowling Green in total. I mean, Nora obviously spent years here, and she also lived in Whitehall and so on before she went to Dublin in 1904. But Joyce's visits to Galway were relatively brief, a holiday of 2 or 3 weeks and, a few days and so on. But he seems to have picked up a great interest in Galway's ancient past. And in his writings, especially in the articles that he wrote in the Italian magazines, for instance, he brought to light the stories that had become almost moribund about the Lynch Memorial Window, for instance. And he really revitalized an interest in that memorial window and the whole story of Lynch hanging his own son. And that began to appear after a lapse, really. It began to appear in the guidebooks, and an awful lot of Italian visitors used to come and seek it out. We used to give tours years ago of Button Island and the lighthouse out there, and I always knew when we had a Joycean scholar in our midst, whether they were from Italy or France or wherever, when they wanted to find out where the Margaretta rocks were, at the Margaretta Shoal, because of course Joyce referred to those as well. Joyce seems to have heard a song that was written about the mayor of Galway supposedly hanging his own son, and that was written around 1900 or slightly earlier by Matilda Reddington, she of the Reddington family in Claredon Bridge. She was a committee member of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society, and she had an interest in collecting songs. And the Keane sisters, Sarah and Rita, had a wonderful version of this song about Mayor Lynch of Galway hanging his son. Now, whether Matilda Reddington wrote it all herself or whether it was based on an earlier song, we don't know. But one of the traditions about Joyce is that one of the songs that he was trying to learn when he was down in Bowling Green was the song about Lynch hanging his son. So it's an interesting, I suppose, take on his attitude to Galway. He saw it as a place of myth and legend. He himself felt that he was one of the tribes, and he writes that he feels that he's one of the tribes of Galway, one of the Joyces. Whether it was a club that would have had him as a member or vice versa, we don't know. The other thing that he seems to have cottoned on to, and maybe one of the guides in here, or maybe somebody who gave him a tour of the church, maybe they were just trying to plumb awesome when they said that one of the tombs down here in the Lynch's south transept, that was actually a Joyce tomb. But that tradition seems to have been there for a while. And as late as 1974, even some of the experts on Irish medieval art mistook this from a Joyce, as a Joyce tomb. And they were probably basing this on what had been collected, what lore had been collected by Joyce over the centuries, over the previous century. So, although he spent relatively little time in Galway, he managed to promote Galway in a way that he probably wasn't aware of. You'd wonder what he would have made of his image on some of the pubs around Galway. A famous Driggs company, for instance, had a plaque with the portrait bust of Joyce with his glasses separately attached on. Up until recently, up there at Richardson's, and of course that was a Joycean link with Michael Sonny Bodkin and so on was there. And you would wonder what he would make of the Nora gin, for instance, which is now being manufactured in Galway. So Joyce seems to have had an ear for the myth and legend, and a lot of myth and legend, new myth and legend, has been created about Joyce and his visit here. I used to hear stories years ago that he used to go down around the abattoirs and the butcher shops, which were a common feature of that whole area around Nora Barnacle's house, and that young fellas used to come out of the abattoir with a pig's head or a cow's head, and that Joyce was a bit squeamish, and he used to try to avoid them. The other stories as well that you hear about him writing on the cuffs on the cuffs of his shirt in the shop there just opposite the Barnacle house. He was trying to listen to the intonation and listen to the accent, the Galway accent. And the old shows will tell you, or the tradition is that, of course, once people began to realize that he was trying to take down what they were saying or listen to the accent or whatever, they speeded it up and they started talking all sorts of raw mate altogether. So these are the things that have become known about Joyce. Many of them are items of folklore, but I suppose it shows the impact that Joyce and his muse, Nora Barnacle, had. Now, Nora, of course, there's no place you could hardly throw a stone in Galway, as the expression goes, without hitting some area that was associated in some way or other with Nora and the Barnacle family. Whether it was number 15 Dominic Street, whether it was Whitehall, whether it was Richardson's pub up in Eyre Square, whether it was Presentation Road, the place where she worked for the nuns in the Gate Lodge there at the Presentation Convent. There's almost nowhere that you don't have some association with Nora. Now, when I'm filling out my census form in a couple of days' time, I'm thinking of looking to the future, because heritage is not just about the past, it's about the present and the future as well, and it always will exist and has to exist and should be preserved and so on. And I'm going to be asking my fellow heritage officer of the future of 2122, what's going on in Galway? Has the Joyce Museum been built yet? How many heritage officers have we, and do we have a rake of assistants? Do we have 3 or 4 arts officers? And, I'll be asking, what about the museum, and has it been expanded? I might even talk to the ghost of Mr. Coles, if he's still around in the church, and I might ask him, have words gone out of the language? Or is the phrase vulture fund still around? Or has a vulture just reverted to being a bird rather than a nasty creature? I'll be asking to the people in the future, I'll be saying, how's Mogul doing? Now, Mogul, of course, is the Museum of Galway Literature, which is going to exist in the future. Has to really, it should be here now. I'll be asking what Joycean material has been acquired recently in our standalone, large Galway City Archive. I'll be asking how the three museums are going. I'll be asking what's the crack like in the School of Music. I'll be asking what news of the Municipal Art Gallery. How's Courge going in the Arts Festival and the Great Read? Are they continuing to thrive? And I'm hoping that all the questions will reflect an interest in Galway's heritage, literary, cultural, natural, fauna, flora, every aspect of heritage, and that the interest will still be there when somebody reads my census form in a century's time. So let us rejoice and think of Nora and James and the future of their heritage as well as its past. Thank you.
Oh, the home is sad and lonely now, Mavuni. I miss your step and sweet smile at the door. I'll never hear your sweet voice to me calling, or list to songs we sang in days of yore. For all around the place is so forsaken, there is only just a memory of me. And every day that comes makes me grow fonder of you and your blue eyes, oh Pat McCree. Come back again to me, Mavoni. I'm so lonely since the day you sailed away. Oh, the home is so forsaken, that's why my heart is aching, and I long to see you back in Galway Bay. Oh, I wandered through the valleys and the wild woods, through meadows where we often used to play, to the ivy-covered church around the corner, where we used to gather blossoms sweet in May. The tales of love I told you in the twilight are only just a memory of thee, and the tender kiss you often so you gave me still lingers on my lips now you're not here. Come back again to me, Mavoni. I'm so lonesome since the day you sailed away. The home is so forsaken, that's why my heart is aching, and I long to have you back in Galway Bay. Yes, the home is so forsaken, that's why my heart is aching, and I long to have you back in Galway Bay.
Thank you, Carmel, for that beautiful rendition of that lovely old Galway song, Mavurneen. So, ladies and gentlemen, our first section this evening will include readings from our guest speakers, music and poetry. Nuala O'Connor is a novelist, short story writer and poet. Her fifth novel, Nora, is about Nora Barnacle, wife and muse to James Joyce, and was published to critical acclaim in the USA, Ireland, the UK and Germany, and is forthcoming in other languages. It was named as the Top 10 2021 historical novel by the New York Times, no mean feat, Nuala, and has been chosen by Dublin City Libraries, as I said before, as their citywide read for One Dublin, One Book Initiative 2022. Nuala has curated the current exhibition at the Museum of Literature Ireland, Loves, says Bloom, on the Joyce family for Ulysses 100. Following Nuala's readings, our musicians will play some music reflecting Nora's life and time spent in Europe. Ray Burke, our other special guest, is a Galwegian and a graduate of NUI Galway. A journalist for over 40 years, he was news editor of the Irish Press and chief news editor of RTE News. He has written about James Joyce for RTE News, the National Library of Ireland and the Connacht Tribune. 2022 marks the centenary of the publication of Joyce's Ulysses. And while his Galway links, the most notable being Nora Barnacle, may be a little less known, they are nonetheless significant and are beautifully captured in the updated edition of Joyce County by Ray Joyce, published by Artisan House. Following Ray's readings, Joyce's poem, She Weeps Over Rahoon, will be read by my colleague Liz Kane, accompanied by Emily Graney on harp. Both Ray and Nuala's books will be signed later on at the end of the performance if anybody wants to purchase them. So I now hand you over to Nuala.
Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks to Jackie from Dublin City Libraries for organising this month-long series of events, kicking off our Irish leg tonight in Galway, which I'm delighted about. I'm going to read two short extracts from the novel. The first one is set in Galway in 1912, when Nora came here with her daughter Lucia to visit. She was 8 years out of Ireland at this stage. She had recently begun to correspond with her mother, Annie Healy Barnacle, again, and she was spooked by the death of Joyce's sister. She feared her own people might die before she'd see them again, so she decided to come back for a visit. Was the air in Galway always so crisp and cool? I fancy it was. I just never knew warm Mediterranean air when I was a girl, and the contrast now astonishes me. The seaweedy smell that is Galway fills my nose as soon as I step from the train station onto Eyre Square, and I feel as if I shall cry. The sweet familiarity of home moves me, but with it returns all the ache of being young, the wanting to leave and explore the world outside County Galway, but not being able to see ahead to what would be. Soon I see my Uncle Michael Healy, who will put us up in his house on Dominic Street, coming at a trot across Eyre Square towards us. He looks through me, though I reach out my hand, and walks straight past us. When I turn my head back, my mother is standing before me. "Oh, Nora," she whispers, and she falls onto me and holds me tight to her chest. We break apart and stare at each other. Mammy looks older and a bit careworn, but she's neatly dressed and well-groomed, and I'm glad to see it. "This is Lucia," I say, pulling my daughter forward. Uncle Michael is back, his face all astonishment. "Well now, Nora Barnacle, aren't you the lady, Alana?" he says. "I wouldn't have known you from the man in the moon." He looks to Mammy. "Isn't she a picture, Annie?" "Most certainly," Mammy says. "But she's Mrs. Joyce now, Michael. You must call her that." "Nora does nicely," I say, glancing for a second at the wink of my gold band. Mammy passes her fingers affectionately across Lucia's cheek. "And look at this bonny girline." I look around, feeling a little self-conscious in my cream coat and blue toque. Every woman in sight is in practical black, though it's July. But Mammy's and Uncle Michael's eyes are so wide with admiration that I choose to carry myself as I would in Trieste. Let's get you down to Dominic Street, Uncle Michael says. I'll have your trunk sent down. He waves for a cab. Will we walk, Mammy? I say. Sure, it's no distance at all. My mother nods and we join arms, though it was never our custom before. Uncle Michael hoists Lucia up to carry her, and on we go. Uncle Michael's house sleeps, all is quiet. He's abed, for he rises early, and Lucia is tired from all the novelty of meeting a score of relatives in her granny's house on Bowling Green. Uncle Tommy was stiff with me, and I with him. I was nervous about seeing him. But he didn't affect me in the end. He seemed wary of me, too. What matter? Years have passed. I take my paper and pencil from the trunk. My heart is unsettled. It's like I'm here but not here at the same time. There's a dreamy feeling about seeing familiar sights, Lynch's Castle, the edge of the Claddagh village, the fast wash of the Atlantic that has my nerves tumbled. Even Mammy's tiny house. The air in Galway feels sharp and unforgiving, and the constant lid of cloud seems to push down on me. I miss the blanketing heat of Trieste, the ordinary comfort of it. I go downstairs and sit in the armchair by the empty grate and wonder why I'm weary of Ireland already and how I'll get through the weeks ahead. So she had left Trieste without Jim and Giorgio, their son. But lo and behold, Jim followed her over because he couldn't be without her. So he turned up at Uncle Michael's house. I'm going to read a second short extract, and this is from later on. So they moved to Paris in 1920, and Ulysses was published 100 years ago this year, in 1922, and fame came to Joyce's door. But fame and its trappings are not easy to deal with. And even though at this point, after years of poverty, they had money, things were not easy. And their daughter Lucia was diagnosed as a hebephrenic schizophrenic early in the 1930s. And the Joyces kept her at home as much as possible, though she was committed a few times and eventually committed for the rest of her life. She spent more than 50 years in an asylum. But I don't know if you know about the Joyces, but they moved house constantly. They had 19 addresses in Paris alone, and here they are at a new address. We've moved to Rue Galilée near the Arc de Triomphe, Lucia with us, reasoning the other side of the river, a fresh place to be in, might do her good. New places always give me and Jim energy, and we're hoping it will be the same for Lucy. Jim takes my hands in his. Nora, he says, the word Galilée means to roll oneself onto the Lord, meaning to trust him. I nod. Jim cares nothing for God, of course, but he's offering me hope, which heartens me. Our subtle and barbaric Lucy is quiet in Galilée, he says. Let's trust in that. Lucia is taking art lessons with Marie Laurencin, and Jim is trying to keep a booklet of his poems with Lucia's artworks in it published. It keeps them busy. He still can't acknowledge that there's something serious wrong with her, something that may not have a cure. Georgie firmly believes his sister to be mad, as does Helen and the Jolases too. And I live on the edge of a cliff, waiting always for the next storm that will knock us all into the sea. Dr. Code recommends a new physician to us, Henri Veen, a gynecologist. Though not a mind man, Code says, he knows much about women's brains. I am hopeful about Miss Joyce's state, Veen tells us when we meet him, but says little else. Jim nods happily. Good, good, he says, clutching at anything that might mean Lucy is curable. What this Veen's seawater injection therapy has to do with improving Lucy's condition, I do not know, I say. I'm exasperated with the string of doctors we must see and their contrary reports on Lucia's state of mind. We have to follow every path, Nora, Jim says, gladden himself that he's doing his best for our daughter, trying things out. He thinks he can reverse her malady. He just needs to find the right things to do. Jim gives Lucy 4,000 francs to buy a fur coat. My wish for you, Lucia Anna, is warmth and beauty, he says, handing over the envelope, bulging with notes. My wish for her is peace and sanity. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Joanna, for the invitation. Thanks very much. It's Nuala who's most responsible, so thank you, Nuala, for my being here. Nuala is the person who invited me, and I said this once before, but I think Nuala O'Connor is probably the first writer associated with Galway to make any New York Times top 10. So, so you could put that in your museum when you open it. I'm going to reverse the order in which I read. I was asked to read two excerpts, and I'm just not ready for the other one yet. This is about Ulysses and how important Nora was in the writing of Ulysses. Today is April the 1st. It was 100 years ago today that Nora set out from Paris to come to Galway for the very last time with their two children. And she came after a row with James. He didn't want her to come at all. He was fiercely opposed to it because, as you know, civil war was looming, and he was really afraid of violence all his life. And he had lost 3 or 4 very close friends between the Easter Rising and the War of Independence and the First World War. So he was really opposed to violence. He was totally opposed to them coming, but she wanted to come anyway. It was April 1, 1922. Ulysses had been published on February 2nd, just a couple of months earlier. So there was a bit of money available for the first time. She wanted to show off. She wanted to come home. She wanted her children to meet their grandparents. So these few pages, this excerpt is about Ulysses. Galway and Connemara are mentioned numerous times in Ulysses, the Joyce masterwork that is widely regarded as the greatest novel written in the English language. Throughout the epic, Joyce retells many tales that he heard from Nora Barnacle or her family, resulting in mentions of Galway or Galwegians or Connemara in 14 of the book's 18 chapters, or episodes as Joyce himself preferred to call them. Quote, "Of all the people who made Ulysses possible, the most important is Nora Barnacle," wrote the Harvard University literary historian Kevin Birmingham in 2014. He added that the date of her first meeting with Joyce, June 16, 1904, quotes, "hovers over everything that happens in Ulysses." Joyce's choice of that date suggests that, quotes, "the novel was, at least in part, a monument to his marriage to Nora," according to Michael Barsanti, curator of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, where a manuscript of Ulysses in Joyce's own handwriting, posted from France, is kept. The most eminent Joyce biographer and scholar, Richard Ellman, who came to Galway actually to do his research, agreed. He said, "Joyce remembered the date with sacramental precision. He encouraged his admirers to call it Bloomsday." Richard Ellman also said, "To set Ulysses on that date was Joyce's most eloquent, if indirect, tribute to Nora, a recognition of the determining effect upon his life of his attachment to her. On June 16, as he would afterwards realise, he entered into relation with the world around him and left behind him the loneliness he had felt since his mother's death." The novel's first and last lines carry echoes of Galway. Its very first 4 words, "stately, plump Buck Mulligan," refer to Oliver St. John Gogarty, a sometime Joyce friend who had very strong Galway connections. And the final lines, where Molly recalls being kissed under the Moorish wall, have been linked to Nora Barnacle's recollections of being courted in Galway near the Spanish Arch. The first words spoken by any character in Ulysses are Mulligan's Latin Mass Intruibo, and the very last words spoken are Molly's, so they're Nora's really. In those final words, Molly refers to herself as a flower of the mountain and my mountain flower, copying Joyce's own oft-repeated words to Nora in several letters he wrote to her when they were apart. The Molly monologue that fills the novel's last 62 pages is based on Nora's speaking and writing style. Quote, "Do you notice how women, when they write, disregard stops and capital letters?" Joyce asked his brother Stanislaus in a letter accompanied by a note from Nora that illustrated his point. Joyce also said that Molly's monologue was the book's star turn. The opening episode of Ulysses is set in a Martello Tower in Sandy Cove, South Dublin, now at James Joyce Museum, which Oliver St. John Gogarty rented and where he and Joyce briefly lived together with another friend of Gogarty in the summer of 1904, shortly before Joyce eloped with Nora. Gogarty is renamed Malachy Mulligan by Joyce in Ulysses, and as Mulligan, he recites 3 verses of his own poem, the song of the cheerful but slightly sarcastic Jesus, retitled by Joyce, The Ballad of Joking Jesus. This occurs in the opening episode, and Gogarty reappears prominently in several other episodes. Mulligan's aunt, that's Gogarty's aunt, the aunt as she is called in a number of mentions from page 2 onwards, she was Galway-born Annie Oliver, an unmarried sister of Gogarty's mother, Margaret, who lived in the Gogarty household in Dublin when Oliver was growing up. The central couple in Ulysses, Leopold and Molly Bloom, have a Connemara marble clock on the mantelpiece of their home at number 7 Eccles Street, where the Mater Private Hospital now stands. The clock, which they received as a wedding present, had stopped at 4:46 a.m. on the 21st of March 1896, which was Nora Barnacle's 12th birthday, her last birthday before she became a teenager. This is another example of how Joyce would not waste any stone on just one bird, as Fritz Sen observed in Galway, actually, when he was here those 4 or 5 years ago. And Molly, in her famous soliloquy, recalls giving a claddering to an old lover, Lieutenant Stanley Gardner, who was killed in the Boer War in South Africa. She says, the ring must have been pure 16-carat gold because it was very heavy. Molly's former lovers, real and suspected, haunt Leopold Bloom in much the same way that Nora Barnacle's young Galway loves disquieted James Joyce, an obsession that already was manifest in his letters to her and in the short story The Dead, his only stage play Exiles, and in his poem She Weeps Over Rahun. Molly's most remembered erstwhile lover, Harry Mulvey, is based on Nora's last love before she met Joyce, and he is the Galway character who looms largest in the novel Ulysses. Although never seen and referred to mostly only by his surname, Mulvey haunts Molly and her husband throughout the second half of Ulysses. Leopold Bloom mentions Mulvey, whom he has never met, 4 times before Molly wallows at length in memories of her passionate times with him under the rhododendrons in Howth. It was Mulvey who gave her the claddagh ring for luck that she later passed on to Lieutenant Gardner. Like Michael Fury in The Dead, Lieutenant Mulvey is a fictional composite of the young Galway loves that Nora told Joyce about. But he is modelled mainly on her last Galway boyfriend, Willie Mulvey, from Newtown Smith, which adjoins Bowling Green, just across the road. Nora left Galway after one of her uncles violently broke up her liaison with Willie Mulvey because his family were Protestants. One of Nora's childhood friends, Mary O'Halloran, told the Joyce biographer Richard Ellman that she and Nora would pretend they were going out walking in the evening, but she would sit and wait in the Abbey Church on Francis Street while Nora spent her time with Mulvey. She said, then one night poor Nora was caught. Her uncle Tommy, he followed her down till she went in home and he gave her a bad beating. The following week she left for Dublin. The real Willie Mulvey was the eldest son of a Royal Irish Constabulary pensioner who had been stationed in Galway and Ardmore as a policeman. Willie had moved out of the family home in Newtown Smith, which adjoins Bowling Green, when the 1901 census was taken, and he was working as an accountant in Joe Young's mineral water company on Eglinton Street, where the outdoor sports shop is now. When he went out with Nora, Joyce wrote in a letter to Nora, "Can your friend in the soda water factory write my verses?" Assuming Mulvey to be the first Muses Leopold Bloom, displaying similar jealousy. Earlier in like vein, he says, Molly, Lieutenant Mulvey that kissed her under the Moorish wall beside the gardens. 15, she told me. Mulvey was the first, confirms Molly in her soliloquy, ensuring that the tryst between Nora Barnacle and Willie Mulvey in turn of the century Galway would enter literary history. I knew more about men and life when I was 15 than they all know at 50, Molly adds. And as she recalls lying with Bloom among the rhododendrons on Howth Head, she says, I'll leave that. It's okay, it's fine, it's not like what you'd read in Nora's novel. The second thing I was going to read, and I hope I can get through it, is what I think is Joyce's most candid and kind of rawest depiction of Nora and of their relationship. In The Dead, that fantastic, magnificent short story, there's a little bit of the Nora character, Greta Conroy, being a kind of a wife who's married to a kind of an eccentric writer and who has a lot to put up with. But in the play Exiles, which is very, very rarely staged and which has never been staged by Druid, for instance, it's a 3-act play, but it wasn't very successful. The Abbey Theatre said no to it, and I think it was only staged in Berlin briefly and in London very, very briefly. RT actually filmed a version of it, and I think you could find it on the RT archives. But as I said, this was written 6 or 7 or 8 years after the dead. It was written shortly after their 1912 visit to Galway that Nuala spoke about. And I think the marriage was gone a little bit stale, and it's quite raw, and it's very candid about where they found themselves. Joyce's notes for the play Exile confirmed that the play, like the dead, and like She Weeps Over Rahun before it, and like much of Ulysses after it, draws heavily on his obsession with Nora's former and potential lovers. An added autobiographical leitmotif was Joyce's horror and fascination at how Nora's beauty continued to attract admirers, coupled with his own difficulties with monogamy after the first decade and a half of his life with Nora. The Nora character in Exiles is Bertha. She's the wife of Richard Rowan, a writer. She is a young woman of graceful build. She has dark grey eyes. She's patient in expression, and she has soft features. Her manner is cordial and self-possessed. During a return visit to Dublin with her husband, Bertha is being importuned by his former close friend, Robert Hand, a successful journalist. Emotionally charged recriminations abound in this play, which Joyce began to prepare after his bitter final departure from Ireland in 1912, and which is more autobiographical and candidly transparent about his life with Nora than any of his other works, in my view. You told me I was hanging a weight around my neck, Richard reminds Robert, in an obvious reference to the jibes that Joyce's friends made when he eloped with Nora in 1904. Quote, "Everyone knows that you ran away with a young girl," Robert replies. "How shall I put it? With a young girl who is not exactly your equal?" Bertha, this is the Nora character, she voices what might be blunt truths about Nora's tough early years of exile with Joyce and about the gossip and jibes in Galway and Dublin over their unmarried status. She says, "I gave up everything for him. Religion, family, my own peace." She adds, "I'm only a thing he got entangled with. My son," a nice name they gave those children. "Do you think I'm a stone? Do you think I don't see it in their eyes and in their manner when they have to meet me?" This outburst comes in a conversation with Beatrice, a young woman with whom Robert has been flirting in correspondence and in person. Their conversation goes on. Beatrice says, "Do not let him humble you, Mrs. Rowan." Bertha, harshly, "Humble me? I am proud of myself. If you want to know, what have they ever done for him? I made him a man. What are they all in his life? No more than the dirt under his boots." She stands up and walks excitedly to and fro. "He can despise me too, like the rest of them now, and you can despise me, but you will never humble me." I think that's Nora Barnacle speaking. I think I'll leave it at that, actually.
She weeps over Rahun. Rain on Rahun falls softly, softly falling, where my dark lover lies. Sad is his voice that calls me, sadly calling at grey moonrise. Love, hear thou, how soft, how sad his voice is, ever calling, ever unanswered, and the dark rain falling, then as now. Dark too our hearts, O love, shall lie and cold as his sad heart has lain, under the moon-grey nettles, the black mould, and muttering rain.
Last year, Galway Public Libraries organised a project titled 1921, A Dialogue Through Poetry and Music, which was a collaboration between 5 poets and musicians who were commissioned to create new poetry and musical works on the theme of 1921. Nora Barnacle Speaks is the title of the poem written by Nuala O'Connor for this project, with music composed by Roisin Mannion, arranged by Tomás, with Emily on harp and concertina. Following the video of this poem, Liz will sing The Sally Gardens, a song that was loved by James Joyce and was part of his repertoire. We will conclude this section with a conversation, and I know we're all waiting for this, between Nuala and Ray, facilitated by Emily Cullen. Emily, for those of you who do not know, is a harper, scholar and cultural producer who has performed throughout Europe, Australia and the United States and has recorded on a number of albums. She has published 3 collections of poetry, and one of them, Conditional Perfect, was included in the Irish Times roundup of the best new poetry of 2019. Emily was also part of the project 1921, a dialogue through poetry and music. She is the former director of the Patrick Kavanagh Centenary and of the Coach International Festival of Literature. Emily is now, and she's very busy, the inaugural Mescal UL 50 Poet in Residence at the University of Limerick. I hope you enjoyed this section. Thank you.
1904. To Jim, I am Ireland. I am island-shaped, he says, small as the Muglins, a woman splayed and hungry, waiting for her lover. I am limestone and grass, heather and granite. I am rising paps and cleft of valley. I am the raindrops that soak and the sea that rims the coast. Jim says I am harp and shamrock, tribe and queen. I am high cross and crowned heart. I am turf, he says, and bog cotton. I am the sun pulling the moon to smile over the Mamturk mountains. I am pirate queen and cattle raider. I am his blessed little blackguard. I am, he says, his auburn marauder. I am his honourable barnacle goose. Nora, Jim says, you are syllable, word, sentence, phrase, paragraph and page. Your fat vowels and shushing sibilants. Nora, Jim says, you are story. (1921). I am a fresh map now, all flux and flow. I am Dublin, where our union seeded and love bloomed. I am the glacial air of Zurich, made warm by womanhood. I am Pola, tatering with unrest, a temporary lay-by. I am the Bora that sings down from the Carso over sea-jewelled Trieste, the city of my mothering. I am my daughter's grace and malady, my son's melody and gloom. I am Paris, that lamp for lovers that lured us back and back. I am Wagner and La Boheme and the Lass of Oprum. I am and am not plump Molly, all plabber in the nest of her bed. I am Galway still, an ill-fitting shawl around altered shoulders. I am Nora. I am my own story. I am Nora. I own my own story.
I am the sea that rims the coast. I am the raindrops that soak. I am the crowned heart and pirate queen. I am the sun and the moon. I am Nora, my own story. I am Nora.
Down by the Sally Gardens, my love and I did meet. She passed the Sally Gardens with little snow white feet. She bid me take love easy as the leaves grow on the tree. But I, being young and foolish, with her did not agree.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here with these two wonderful authors this evening. And I enjoyed both of your books so much, and a stunning achievement really from you both. Nuala, how does it feel to be the one Dublin, one book choice for this year?
I mean, it's just wonderful. They pick a book every year that has either the author's connection to Dublin or the book has a connection to Dublin, and that's readable, shall we say, accessible for a lot of different people, because it's a range of people. It's through the libraries. It's a council initiative, but it's run by Dublin City Libraries and the UNESCO City Literature Office. So a huge honour, and there's 28 events. I'm directly involved with 17 of them, so I have a good run of things to do in April. So yeah, a variety.
It's lovely to be part of the pantheon now with Plunkett and all the
yes,
and
Joyce
Liam
Dubliners
is one of them. And
This is a great range of books.
Well, it's Nora's night and it's Galway's night, but I just wanted to, I suppose, the conversation by asking each of you about your process. And Nuala, if I could start with yourself, a biofiction writer. It's a fascinating terrain. And, it's a world-famous love story that you took on, a formidable challenge. So what encouraged you to take on the love story of James and Nora, and what were some of the challenges that you encountered?
I suppose, like all projects like this that you take on, you're aware it's going to take you a couple of years. And so you have to be enthused by the subject matter. And again, it's usually like a clash of things that happen. So I was studying Italian by night in NUI Galway, and I had to write an essay about Joyce, and I kept while I was researching, I kept peering over his shoulder to see what Nora was doing, and started a thought process about how did she feel about her life with Joyce. Before that, I had adopted a cat and named her Nora Barnacle, and I had read the Brenda Maddox's wonderful biography of Nora when it came out in 1989, and I had seen Pat Murphy and Jerry Stembridge's 2000 film with Susan Lynch as an astonishingly sensual and wonderful Nora. So I was very aware of Nora. I went to the annual celebration at 8 Bowling Green. On Bloomsday every year, there was always music and drink and fun and readings. I was always at that. So I was very aware of her as this earthy, pragmatic, charismatic woman who had run away unmarried to Europe with Joyce and had buoyed him up, essentially. So I wrote, the time I was doing the essay, I started to write a short story about Nora and Jim, and it was basically their first 4 or 5 months together was the story. But when I had finished the story, as they're leaving Ireland on the boat, I thought, I'm not finished with her. I want to commune with her longer. And so I decided I would stay with her to her end, in fact, in 1951. And so the book became this enormous thing. It was like a Jeffrey Archer-sized book, which is not what literary fiction usually is. But the story was big and it needed that size. It ended up at about 120,000 words. We cut several scenes, actually. The one, I think you mentioned Riders to the Sea, Ray, that Nora had been in the Sing play and Joyce had put it on in Zurich. And I had that whole scene in there and my editor cut it. And I had various other scenes with Nora alone, with the children or whatever. But it was like every scene that Joyce wasn't in, the editor wanted gone. So...
Well, it's a stunning achievement, Nuala, and it's an art in itself, really, to be able to tackle historical figures and find their voice and inhabit their voice. I'm very curious about biofiction. I'm fascinated by it. How much poetic license can a novelist take, or should one take, writing biofiction and being faithful to the facts as well?
Yeah, my agent keeps telling me to drop the term biographical fiction. She just says, just call it a novel. Stop saying that, because of people's expectations and also limitations around it. But I am what I would call a pretty faithful biofictional writer, in that I take the facts and I use them, and I only festoon a little bit for dramatic purposes. But what you are in the business of doing is animating people, creating probable, believable scenes in their lives, empathizing with them and embodying them. It's not hagiography. You're not writing a sort of a biography that praises them top to bottom. You're presenting them warts and all. So all of the flaws that we all have as humans and that Joyce and Nora had are in the novel, and just their struggles, and they had many struggles.
Well, you've executed so wonderfully, and I agree with the New York Times reviewer who said Nora is entirely convincing. So congratulations again. Ray, I read your two books in tandem, and they made lovely companion books. And Ray, you know, the connections with Galway are so manifold and so, you know, substantial, and yet nobody had really tackled the connections with Joyce in a systematic way before you wrote Joyce County. What sparked this book? And I wonder why it hadn't been tackled before, because
I don't know. I joked that there are probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of books about Joyce. I think only Shakespeare exceeds him in the number of critical books. I don't know why anybody hasn't done it before. I stumbled into it really. I went to school across the road, and my national school was St. Patrick's, which adjoins Bowling Green. My secondary school was St. Joseph's, Nuns Island, across the river. And then with a couple of fellas in the audience there, we strolled from secondary school up to the university. But after university, I moved to London, so I'm an exile from Galway still. When you read The Dead, and Greta says, "I'd love to see Galway again," that jumps out at you. And then later on, Greta recalling her one of her courtships, she says, we used to go out together walking the way they do in the country, and that rings a bell. So I got drawn into The Dead, discovered what a fantastic story it was, and I link it as much to Galway as anyone would to Dublin. But then I read the other stories in Dubliners, and they are fantastically constructed, perfect short stories, written by a man in his early 20s, with no word processor, with pen and ink, no cut and paste, no delete button, and they are just fantastic. So from that, my interest was awakened. I had read A Portrait of the Artist at university. When I was living in London, I was sharing a house with people from Australia and New Zealand and England. One of my English friends, when we would have some wine taken, she used to say to me, "You are a disgrace. You're a university graduate from Ireland and you haven't read Ulysses. You're an utter disgrace." So I tried to read Ulysses and abandoned it. Yeah. But then when I came back to Dublin, I tried again, and the RTE audio version of Ulysses is superb, absolutely superb. So I kind of got interested from there. How the book came about, I by accident met Dave O'Connell, who's the editor of the Connacht Tribune, one day. We knew each other because I'd written a few pieces for the Connacht Tribune, and it was 2011, and he said to me, "Are you writing anything these days away from your day job?" And I don't know what made me say it. I said, "I'm not, Dave, actually, but next year, 2012, it will be 100 years since James Joyce visited Galway." And, he rode on the Corrib, he sailed to the Aran Islands, he took a train to Clifton, he went to the Galway races. He did all those things because of Nora Barnacle. And Dave said to me, "Stop talking about it, write it." So I started, and I rang him up after a few weeks, and I said, "Look, I have 1,000 words done, but I can do more." So he said, "Keep writing, because January after Christmas is really quiet and you'll fill a few pages for me." I did a 3-parter in the Connacht Tribune, and then a few years later, just kind of detoxing from my day job, I just thought, maybe if I expanded the Connacht Tribune articles, it might make a nice guidebook for visitors to Galway, a little guidebook or something that students in Galway might like. And that's how the 2016 book, it grew out of that. And I kind of retired from my day job in 2018, and 2020 was looming. Galway year as European Capital of Culture, and I thought about redoing it maybe, but we let it slide, and thank God I dodged that bullet. But subsequently I had seen some Artisan House books, and they were really beautiful productions. And I just wrote to the bosses of Artisan House, Mary Ruddy and Vincent Murphy, and said, what do you think? And they came back to me and said, come out to Connemara and talk to us. I looked at the notes I had been making kind of desultorily since 2016. I said, no, I got cold feet. I said, no, it's not worth it. There's not enough to add. But I met them and they persuaded me. They said, you know, you could do 10,000 extra words. Yeah. We'll get someone to do a foreword. Yes. We'll get photographs, we'll get drawings. Yeah. And we got from Inuit Galway, or UCG as it was when I was there.
So much as well.
They allowed us to reproduce the poem in Joyce's own handwriting with the initial capitals from Lucia that he presented to the university. So Artisan House did a fantastic job. It's far better than I could have expected it to be. So that's how it happened.
Stunning. It's so enriched by the illustrations as well. I mean, your writing is absolutely stunning because you're synthesizing so much fact and you have a beautiful narrative style.
Thanks very much.
Very readable. And then to see a postcard from Joyce, which you sent to the James Hardiman Library, reproduced, and Lucia's own drawings. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
How did you synthesize, how did you select the material that you wanted to include?
I don't know. It's I totally, unlike Nuala, I couldn't write a paragraph of fiction. I just do reportage and news writing, and I don't know. I started off trying to expand the 3 pieces that I did in the Connacht Tribune, actually. And in the course of doing that, I thought, well, that actually might make a separate chapter, and that might make a separate chapter. And just it gradually lent itself to 10 or 11 little chapters on little subjects. It just evolved kind of organically.
And as Jim Higgins noted earlier, Joyce became something of an expert on Galway history. He studied James Hardiman's.
Well, I wouldn't quite go that far now. I think.
But he really dived into the history of Galway.
Well, I think
the Il Piccolo and the Italian papers.
Yeah, I mean, I would say they immigrated in 1904. Before Joyce and Nora left Ireland, Joyce had only ever been in Dublin, Cork and Mullingar. When he was a child, his dad brought him to Cork, where he came from, briefly. And when he was a teenager, his dad was overseeing, I think, an election count in Mullingar, so he was there briefly. He was never in Connacht, so he came to Galway because of Nora. Yes. And yes, he was captivated, and Nora's uncle told him a lot about Galway history. I think the Hardiman thing, I would say he was either in a public library in Galway or up in the University College Library. I mean, as a graduate of University College Dublin in those times, I'd say he could easily walk into University College Galway. There were so few graduates in Ireland at the time and say, I'm here, can I have a look? I mean, he stole stuff from Hardiman's history, and it's not all reliable in Hardiman's history. The Lynch hanging story certainly is not reliable.
And of course, the linguistic history of the Lynch entering the English language would have fascinated him as well.
Yes,
the lynching.
Yes.
I suppose, how do you think Galway shaped Nora, Nuala? I mean, she's fundamentally Galway, and your poem beautifully captured that, you know. And she was everything to Joyce, wasn't she? She was his rock, she was his muse, you know, and she evoked the West for him.
Yeah, I mean, when he approached her that day on the 10th of June 1904 on Nassau Street, he just spotted this gorgeous auburn-haired girl and approached her essentially. He must have been delighted, firstly, when he heard her accent, which would have been very exotic to his ears, because as Ray said, he would have been mildly clueless about the Galway accent. And then when she said her name was Nora Barnacle, he must have been doubly excited, because not only did he revere Ibsen's Nora, he also must have been delighted as a writer to hear this surname, Barnacle. What a gift to a writer. And then further to that, when he spoke to her and discovered she had confidence to match his own, fabulous turns of phrase and stories, and was like him a talker and loved music too. So they bonded a lot over music and singing. So he must have been utterly delighted with the catch he made that day. Yes. She saw him and he was in some eccentric outfit. He had a long white coat on, a pale coloured coat. and a yachting cap, and she thought he was a Swedish sailor approaching her. But Nora, as we know, had 3 Galway boyfriends that we know about. So the 2 Michaels and Willie, all of whom were educated men. So Joyce's educated voice would have pleased her because she liked an educated man. So they were a nice match to each other, yin and yang very much, but a huge and wonderful complement to each other.
Yeah. And you mentioned the wonderful Susan Lynch, and I also think of Angelica Houston's portrayal of Greta in The Dead, and she captured her self-composure, didn't she, and her magisterial presence, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so beautifully.
Joyce talked a lot to Nora. He wrote her the most astonishing letters about her nobility and her dignity. And I think Angelica Houston captured both those things in the Greta character. And you mentioned Bertha, who's not much talked about Ray. But again, she has the physicality of Nora and the qualities of Nora. And Nora's ability to stand up for herself. So there's been a lot of snobbishness about Nora from academics in the past. I think this has been corrected. But certainly the expat community in Paris did not understand why Joyce was not with a woman who was educated to the level that he was. They didn't understand Irish culture, that it was normal to leave school at 12, etc., etc. But also snobbishness about her disinterest in literature. You know, that this modernist genius was married to this woman who preferred to read the Daily Mail and Penny Dreadfuls. It was like a dissonance to these people.
And yet she impressed them all in other ways with her personality and her, raconteur abilities. And
the ones who bothered to get to know her could see exactly what she was to Joyce, and that she was actually the perfect. Sylvia Beach, who very generously published Ulysses when nobody else would, said that the Joyce marriage was the happiest of any writer's marriage that she knew. And you only have to look at the other marriages that were surrounding them, say Hemingway, who was constantly cooking up the next wife while one was still married to him. He was constantly changing wives. Their other friends were like Juna Barnes, and also like Helen Castor, who married Giorgio, though she may have been after Joyce originally. She settled for Giorgio, who was 11 or 12 years younger than her. She was still married, and Nora and Jim, although unmarried themselves, were disgusted at this public display of infidelity that their son was embroiled in. And Helen wasn't allowed in their house. They had a funny sort of bourgeois and kind of square attitude to life by the time they came to Paris in their 40s. And they're in with the lost generation, who are all very open about their bodies. They speak openly about things. And Nora and Jim don't like it at all. They're quite like a very ordinary middle-class Catholic Irish couple in a sense, even though you read his writing and you go, what? He didn't like people who cursed in front of him, for example. And then you read the work and it's very difficult to understand.
Well, Ray, you have some wonderful quotations there, and I think they articulate very well what, the unique marriage, the unique relationship, and how important Nora was to Joyce. Pádraig Cullum and his wife Mary, for example, wrote, Mrs. Joyce, with her rich personality, her sincere and steadfast character, is an ideal companion for a man who has to do Joyce's work. And then his wife Mary observed that James Joyce was markedly devoted to Nora. Her personality was full of interest to him, and he delighted in her sayings and snappy remarks. So I think that's a beautiful, articulation of the closeness that they had. And I mean, you capture so much so beautifully, Nuala, from the levity of the spider dance. I love the scenes where Joyce is doing the spider dance to entertain his children, and then the sadness of Lucia and trying to find, the cure for medical help for Lucia, and the episodic way that you structured the book is beautiful as well. Can you tell me a little bit about that? How you chose to, there is a linear kind of temporal movement to it from 1904 up to the end, but you have these short little vignettes are so well done.
Yeah, I mean, when I sort of conceived of the novel, I conceived of it as a novel in flash, and for anyone who doesn't know what flash is, it's very short stories. I wanted each chapter to stand alone, and then of course these are the things you think at the start of a project, and then the whole thing just becomes what it is itself. But I still love short chapters. I think of them as a gift to the reader, because you can just have that little bit. Maybe if you read in bed at night or on the bus, you can read that little bit. And then if you have time, you can read another little bit and know that there'll be a natural sort of a break. Yeah. I love short chapters. I had an editor previously who did not and was always trying to encourage me to write long chapters. And I said to her, I guarantee your readers love short chapters. So I'll stick with that. Thanks.
Back to Galway now, that the Healy's, Michael Healy was a great support to them, wasn't he? And he lived on Dominic Street, number 26 Dominic Street. He was Annie's brother.
Correct.
Yeah.
He was Annie's brother. And he was a family member that Joyce really hit it off with, and they got on very well together. He had a good job. He worked for Customs and Exiles, and he gave them money when they needed money during the First World War. He regularly sent the money. Joyce sent him in thanks first editions of all his books. So they got on really well together. And I know Brendan Maddox and some others have said that it was Nora who accompanied Joyce the day they went out to Inishmore. There's no evidence for that at all. My own view is that it would have been Michael Healy who would have gone with him out there, and who told him a lot about the plans to try to make Galway a transatlantic port, and who probably reminded him about the Indian Empire grounding, which really rang a bell with Joyce because it happened on June 16th. So he said, I'll have that. He didn't let any snippet go to waste, and he mentions that incident in Galway Bay twice in Ulysses. So he and Michael Healy got on really, really well together. But Joyce got on very well with Annie Barnacle as well, with Nora's mother, every time he came to Galway.
And he collected the Lass of Aughrim from her, didn't he?
Correct.
And he said it was worth coming to Galway to hear the Lass of Aughrim from Annie Healy.
Correct.
And we're going to be treated to that shortly.
Yep. And she continued to send him either full Connacht Tribunes or bits of Connacht Tribunes for years and years and years, particularly when he was writing Finnegan's Wake. And he wrote to her, and he cried when she died, when Annie died. He was very close to the Barnacles. Nora's sister Kathleen spent some time with them in London when they were living in London. He did.
He wasn't a snob either. I think it's important to say he was never a snob.
Not sure, no.
He preferred ordinary people to the so-called educated people like himself, and so he could see the
Ulysses full of ordinary people.
Absolutely, and the merit and the beauty of Nora's family. That Nora had a tricky relationship, I think, with her family because she had run away, and that relationship warmed up. Helped hugely then by Joyce befriending both Michael and Annie.
I have to say, as a Rahoon resident, we live right beside the Rahoon Cemetery, and I brought my boys down with their scooters to find Michael Sonny Bodkin's grave. And I think there'll be a lot of literary pilgrimages now all around Galway to all the sites in your book, Ray, after tonight and after this.
Well, it's as Jim said, you could throw a stone from where Nora was born over in what used to be the nurses' home in the grounds of the University College Hospital now, to where she went to school, to where her aunt was, to where she worked, to where she played. Inner city Galway was her area, and
just to conclude, Ray and Nuala, could we honour Nora more in Galway? Could we do more? I know Jim had mentioned about all the different things he'd like the future heritage officers he'd like to see in Galway. Could we have a street or a bridge or a school even, or something named after a statue?
No, most definitely. I think the Gallagher sisters from Woodkey, Sheila and Mary, did a fantastic job by buying the Nora Barnacle house in Bowling Green and maintaining it with no state support at all for a long, long time. It's in kind of disrepair at the moment. And they're hoping to get it going again. And it's a building that's not suitable to have busloads of tourists going through it. But to answer your question, Dublin has 3 James Joyce museums, even excluding Moley and excluding the National Library, which in some ways could be a Joyce museum. If you go to Stratford-on-Avon, the house Shakespeare was born in has been preserved perfectly. Anne Hathaway's house is perfectly preserved. Shakespeare's mother's house is perfectly preserved. The new house that he bought when he got a bit of money is perfectly preserved. His school is perfectly preserved. His sister, who married a herbalist, a doctor, their house is perfectly preserved. If you look at what Stratford has done with the legacy of Shakespeare, and Galway has nothing except the name on a pub to honour Nora Barnacle, who made Joyce what he is, and he is world famous, and he's deservedly world famous because of the fantastic writing that he did, and he could not have done it, and he would not have done it without Nora Barnacle from Bowling Green.
There is a new festival every February called the Love Festival that Margaret Nolan has set up, the visual artist, and that is going to become an annual affair, and it is firmly in honour of Nora and Jim. So that is going to go from strength to strength, no doubt about it. And we have had discussions already about having a physical monument to Nora, whether that is a large mural or something more permanent like a statue. You know, we're going to take that further, I think. Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Emily.
I think we'll all agree that was a wonderfully engaging and informative conversation, and we obviously learned a lot about Nora and James and their life together with those insightful questions and answers. So before we conclude the evening with our final piece of music, I would like to thank all of those who made this evening so possible and so enjoyable. Our guests and contributors, Nuala O'Connor, Ray Burke, Emily Cullen, Jim Higgins and Liz Kane. Our musicians, Carmel Dempsey, Emily Graney and Tomas Mannion. To Catherine Moore Temple and the Committee of St. Nicholas's, their rector, Very Reverend Linda Pilo, for allowing us to use this beautiful, iconic building for this evening. To the staff of the various libraries around the city who promoted tonight's event and are hosting many book clubs on Nora through the month of April. And I would like to especially thank my colleague, Liz Kane, who you heard earlier singing beautifully, who was my right-hand person organising this evening's events. As always, my thanks to GK Media, to Cathal there on sound, to our backstage crew, Colm and Damien, who kind of did all the hard work and the hard lifting earlier on. To Galway City, Decade of Commemorations Committee, who funded this evening, and without funds we can put on events like that, so I really appreciate that. And especially to you, the audience, who turned out so well, who gave your attention and appreciated everything that was in front of them. Thank you very much for coming out. When you organise an event like this, you never know who might approach with something special. I had a wonderful conversation with Aileen McCormack Glynn on the phone, and she told me she wrote a poem in 2004 titled When Nora Met James, to celebrate the centenary of Bloomsday. And we have it on display over there if you'd like to have a read of it. It's really good. So, ladies and gentlemen, our final piece of music is that beautiful song, The Lass of Aughrim. This song was a real favourite of James Joyce. He first heard it when Annie Barnacle sang it, and he loved when he'd come down to Galway, she'd sing it for him. And he mentioned it in his story, The Dead. I hope you have enjoyed your evening celebrations of Nora and James, the Galway story. Safe home, and please enjoy The Lass of Aughrim. Thank you all very much.
Just before The Lass of Aughrim, I think, Josephine Vahy, you did amazing.
As I'm taking you
My babe lies cold within my arms, but none will let me in. Oh, don't you remember one night on yon lean hill when we swapped rings of each other's hands, sorely against my will? Yours was all the beaten gold, mine was but black tin. Yours cost one guinea, love, mine was but 1 cent. The rain falls on my yellow locks, the dew, it wets my skin. My babe lies cold within my arms, but none will let me in. My babe lies cold within my arms, but none